Welcome to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. How do we learn to truly thrive together? How do we stay connected to our authentic selves, each other, and our purpose as a team, especially when challenged? How do we unlock the deeper levels of group intelligence? Enjoy this episode of the Connected Teamwork Podcast and learn practical tools to evolve the connectedness of your team to its next level.
And welcome to the Connected Teamwork Podcast, episode number 78, where we help leaders and teams connect more deeply to themselves, each other, and their purpose. I'm your host, Hilke Faber. I'm here together with my co-host, Carson. Hey, Carson, how are you today?
Hilke, I'm wonderful. Always good to be with you, my friend.
And with you. I'm glad we're going to look today at connected communication practice number 5, which is called choosing your altitude intentionally, as opposed to nose diving into the details and basically losing people. And so let's talk about this as if you think about communication as an act of care, an act of care for ourselves, for the people around us, for what we're here to achieve, then just like when we have dinner, actually, we had people over for dinner yesterday for the holiday, setting the table with intention makes a big difference in terms of how we're going to have the conversation. And there's always kind of the let's microwave this thing quick and slap some things on the table, gives a very different energy than I really want to talk to you about this thing. I'm thinking about an example of a conversation I recently had with a colleague about an agent that we want to work with or not. And the conversation was quickly going to go about to like this agent or that agent, which one is going to be more powerful, more aligned, blah blah blah. But in the end, that conversation was the altitude was too low. It was all about this little detail as opposed to actually thinking about, oh, what do we need an agent for? Oh, we want an agent to help promote this book. And why do we want to promote this book? Oh, we want to promote connectedness as a intelligence in the world. And we want to do so in a way with people that we feel well with, that fits with our business rhythm, our budgets, our goals, all that. So now we first need to actually have a conversation about that, and then we can have a conversation about, is it going to be Mary or John or Sebastian or somebody else that we haven't met yet, right? But if we stayed in this, so we talked to Mary yesterday, what do you think? The conversation would have been about Mary or not, as opposed to what we're actually here to achieve. So not like losing the care towards our topic. I think about this as choosing the altitude is we're going to be deliberate about our own feelings, taking care of our own. We're deliberate about the we, our relationship, what we're here to do, and we were deliberate about the it, what we're here to achieve. And the integration of those three sets the table powerfully. Carson, how do you relate to setting the table, how setting the context in a conversation? How do you work with that?
First off, Hilke, anytime I'm talking to you, I feel like we're flying high, right? When you talk about altitude, when I think about altitude in conversations, this is very appropriate and it's very timely. I was actually reading an article this morning just about the level of pressure and noise that is happening amidst all the evolution of how we work and how we continue to work. And sometimes I marvel at the meetings that I'm on, like just how many, what I like to sometimes call the talking heads, like the people that really have this urge to be seen and heard in any given moment. And so they sometimes I feel like they just kind of grace us with all of their thoughts at once, right? And it's not, sometimes I feel like it misses the mark. When I think about the altitude of a conversation, you've got to make sure you're taking the right pulse check. You've got to meet your team where they are before you elevate them. You can't just drag them where you want them or assume that they are thinking about things the same way that you are. And so I think when you're talking about table setting, one of my favorite sayings is, before you feast, you have to set the table. You've got to be purposeful and intentional about your agenda. What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve on this conversation? You can't also, just like you can't go too high up or too in the weeds, you also can't do too far ahead. Yes, you want to be, prepared for any possible avenues that may open up as a result of your decisions. But you also have to make sure that you execute the right next step. And in my mind, Hilke, it all comes down to clarity. It comes down to ensuring that, you are not taking people on too complex of a journey. There is a value in being, making it as simple as possible in the fact that you're weighing the variables that you're discussing, just like you articulated, because I don't think confusion is something that you want to over communicate and over pivot on. You want to make sure you're being very clear and transparent, but also grounded in what is the objection of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I'm thinking about a conversation that I started having with my team about AI. And, AI is the hot topic of the moment, or maybe of many moments to come. And it's a topic that has a lot of emotional baggage to it. It also creates excitement, another emotion. So, framing it with my team, and I'm curious about how you frame AI conversations with your team in terms of altitude, right? Too high of an altitude with my team would be to philosophize about the impact of AI on society. That's an important topic, but that's not where we were at. The topic that I want to have with my team at that moment was, hey, how can we use AI to make what we do more efficient? And in that process, what are some of the guardrails that we're going to put in place, so that we don't lose the authenticity, the value we add to the client, and so on. So we had a conversation about that, but there was a temptation for me to go too high, which was, is AI going to become our new government? And what do we do about that? Is all that, or too low, which is, which of those AI agents should we use, and which one is better? It feels that felt like too low of an altitude. Carson, in your team, how do you guys talk about AI, and how do you choose the right altitude with AI?
I think it's important to make sure that you are addressing, people's concerns, but on the same token, making sure that once you meet them where they are, you are pivoting the discussion. And I'll give you some examples, very, very akin to what you just described, Hilke. I do have conversations where people are concerned about their jobs changing, their organizations changing, their roles changing, their responsibilities changing, their job being conceivably eliminated. And so I do find as a leader that it's critical that I address where there are legitimate concerns, and talk through that process with them. Okay, I understand. So what you're telling me is you're fearful that the job is going to pivot, that is going to change, but at the core of it, what does our role serve? What do we do? There are things that are still very much human led, that are at the heart of that, and so we need to go. I'll use the old hockey analogy. We got to go where the puck is going. We have to anticipate where things are going while leaning into the unique skills and strengths and superpowers that we as leaders have, that in those human-led functions. But I also, to your point, I'm challenging my team to look at their processes in a given day. What are the things that are taking up a large chunk of time? What are the things that are blockers or that are hurdles? I can't tell you how many times in a given day I'm leveraging AI for, I get a lengthy message from a client or a customer asking me policy questions or asking me very specific technical things that I may not know myself. And before, I would have been tying up my own bandwidth or that of colleagues and peers. Now I can take their email, and in my secure AI environment, I can ping it against all the data that we're sitting on and give them a very astute, educated conversation back, as well as resources that are linked and potential other people that they can talk to. So it saves not only myself, but a lot of people time, and the outcome is better. Furthermore, being able to look at processes in my given day. I used to write I would do newsletters and, events for a large number of organizations. And some of the work that used to take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to do can now be done in minutes. And so I think the other element too is, because we know that there is so much, I would say, angst, but also analysis of how we can and could and should use AI. We've got to lean into that, and we actually have to embrace it and have conversation about it, as opposed to, treating it with any type of stigma. On my team calls every week, we actually have a session around what are you learning and how are you leveraging AI? What's a new prompt maybe that you used over the last week? And I think the better we do a job of sharing that across our team and picking up best practices of how it's being leveraged, not only does it reduce the stigma, but it also makes people so much more effective, and they're able to really feel empowered in this time, which is what is so important.
So with choosing the right altitude, to me, like it's an act of care, because the altitude of too high is, I am scared to engage in the muck of things, in the really real. So what you said, Carson, in this case with AI, I'm going to engage directly into the concern that's happening, without trying to make some Pollyannish silver bullet things that I'm saying, oh yeah, it's all going to be great, and yes, you're going to keep your job, and everything is going to be just better. No, the change doesn't work that way. When we have a leadership conversation, we need to talk about the really real, and say about, okay, so, well, yeah, what could happen? Yes, you could lose your job over this, or your job could change of this. And what you said, and what are we here to do, right? So what are we here to do? That makes it authentic. Too low of an altitude would be to talk about one feature only. And when we see this happening in a meeting, because humans tend to nosedive or fly over. That's what we tend to do. It's two reactions, you could say, from our ego. Why? Flying over is safe, and we might even feel a sense of superiority or knowing, and that's something that the ego loves. Also, nosediving is something that the ego loves, because it gives a false sense of security. Like, now I'm talking about something that I know. Is it Mary, or is it going to be John in this case? But going into this in-between space, it's almost like the liminal space, takes a lot more courage than saying, yeah, I think what we really need to talk about is that. And I'm going to point that out to you. And how I do that often requires me to use some intuition and ask myself, hey, what's this really about? And then call out and try it, and just present it with humility. I would like to speak with you about this. This is why I think using I statements in choosing altitude is also important. Choosing an altitude is a choice, so people understand we could have different conversations. I would like to speak with you about this particular thing, how we make our team efficient. We could also talk about the environment, the environmental, the societal implications. We could talk about this or that. So technology. And today, I'm choosing to spend time with you here. How does that sound to you? That's an act of leadership. So we're going to take a break in a moment. After the break, I would like to talk more with each other about why is it that we might nosedive, and how do we get ourselves out of that? We'll see you right after the break.
You are listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Do you want to learn more about building the next level of connectedness in your team? Please contact Growth Leaders Network on LinkedIn. And now, back to the show.
So choosing altitude is like artistry. We have to be willing to carve out and put that first brushstroke and say, this is what I'm going to talk to you about. Carson, why do we nose dive, or why is it sometimes so hard to make that first brushstroke?
It's very challenging, and I think the key element is these things will happen. They are inevitable. When I was thinking about nosediving, it was reminded of years ago. I ran a division for a large company, and there was a very particular person on our team that tried to force nosedives. They would always ask these questions: "What if?" And it would be almost like the equivalent of, what if a meteorite fell out of the sky and landed on us while we were making this pitch? What do I do? I mean, they were things that had the most astronomical odds of actually transpiring. And as a leader, you can't dismiss the person. You have to acknowledge and see them and understand, but you can't get dragged into emotion. You can't get stuck in the minutia and the details. There's always so much noise. And there's always so much pressure. And as leaders, that altitude element, you're going to be weaving in and out. I was picturing like Tom Cruise as a fighter pilot, like deciding at which altitude am I going to be at any given moment. But I think it's critical to realize like nosedives happen only because of kind of a loss of control of altitude at a team level. And so, that's why, as usual with leadership, it's up to us to find the balance. It's not a lack of capability, but sometimes it could be because that person has not had that particular experience. They don't feel confident or comfortable in those situations. And so sometimes these are things that are brought up while you're in a team setting. So you have to address it, and you have to quell everyone's nerves around the topic while they're there. But I think it also benefits you to be able to pull aside that person in kind of a one-to-one conversation, as you described, Hilke. Hey, I want to talk about the comfort that you have in the direction that we're going. You raised some concerns. Let's talk about that. Tell me more. I think those one-to-one types of conversations are important. And frankly, if they're brought up in a team setting, we can also do it there. But, anytime that the conversation gets tense or defensive, people start talking over each other, or you can feel the, almost the animosity amongst some of the talking heads. People are debating different details. Somebody kind of gets really loud in the conversation. You can sometimes see these things coming, but I feel when that happens, the real reason we're here starts to get avoided. And that's why as leaders, we've got to reset. In fact, I often like at the top of my screen, it will say the topic of the meeting at the top left. And I try to get grounded in that topic or in the agenda. Hey, team, this is great dialogue. Everybody's bringing up a lot of really good intel. This meeting is all about X. I know in the agenda, we wanted to walk away today with this. Where do you think we need to go from here in the conversation? It's not being accusatory or setting up any type of singling out someone for the nosedive. There's no need to blame because it's human. However, how can we course correct? And I find as a leader, it's easier to just get grounded back in. Why are we here?
Why are we here? So that if we're nosediving, it's a human trait. It's a human trait. We all do it. I do it. You do it. Everybody does it. And saying, okay, now how do we get back to the right altitude without making somebody wrong? And I think that is part of the art in doing that well. Now, I don't think there's recipes. A few elements that help me is to keep in mind the humanity of the other person. There's my tone of voice changes if I think you're a schmuck. That I become a little pedantic, or I say something smart, or when I say, "Oh, thank you for sharing," but it's clear that I'm like trying to get out of this. But when I have in mind, like, "Oh, yeah, thank you for sharing," and then almost like in tennis, I take the ball back and say, "Okay, so now I'm thinking about what we really need to talk about now. What's really going to be of service back to the agenda topic. Or if I feel in what the nosedive says is what the nosedive talks about, there's something of value. I might ask, huh, what might be the underlying issue here that would be important for us to talk about? And those two things together, what's the deeper issue, and that might be important to talk about. It does something to people's wisdom, because people are like, oh wait, yes, I'm not just having a conversation here just with myself. I'm actually sitting here in a broader room. So it raises the stakes a little bit. The other thing that I find helpful in setting altitude, and this is subtle, is to be aware of our brain waves. So when we are like our brain waves are the frequency of our brain waves. You can put them on like electroencephalograph, and you could see that if we're very busy thinking, surface very fast brain waves. And when we're starting to be more insightful, more into wisdom, our brain waves slow down, and it often correlated to the pace and the depth of our breathing. So just even if the other person is nosediving and I'm not saying anything, simply me taking a nice deep few breaths, maybe softening my eyes, uh, deliberately slowing down my brain waves. It's almost like we're in an orchestra. The other person's brain somehow usually picks up on that in some way. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Carson?
As you described that, Hilke, I thought about how applicable this is in most personal conversations, right? I mean, these happen in team scenarios, but often, like, even if you're having a conversation with someone that you're close with personally, those conversations can nosedive. And you're not guaranteed to be able to bring them back on track. But if you don't manage that rising tension, that energy of the rising tension, if you don't match it, if you can manage that, not getting lost in the panic, those are the types of things that I believe will help you get it back on track and recalibrate the conversation. As I've advanced as a leader and over time, I really try to observe, and rather than, we've talked about this before, resisting any inclination to feel like you've got to be the smartest person in the room, you can observe, and you can observe the energy. And are you, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, are we advancing along the agenda and the outcomes that we're here to support? And then as you see these nosedives, and, it's funny, I think there are some people that can be chronic nosedivers as well, and they do it for a variety of reasons. They like to kind of throw the grenade into the mix, or they're upset with their current lot in life, so they like to just be rabble rousers, and you get that sometimes. But I think it's important to be able to acknowledge the emotions sometimes in the conversations that are natural, but not to feed into it, not to get lost in it, not to match that energy and to get defensive as a leader. Because again, not everything is going to be perfect. But if you don't recognize that moment, that's when you can lose the room. And so, making sure that, you're constantly, again, going to be needing to make decisions to say, okay, somebody has taken us into the weeds here, or somebody has taken us too high. I have to meet that for a moment, and then I've got to make a conscious decision to bring it back to center. And my gosh, like, you can use that analogy with a lot of things, political rhetoric, from one side to the following. Rarely is there truth at far sides of opposite. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and we have to consciously acknowledge people where they are, because they are very passionate. There's something, I believe, to be learned from most everyone, maybe not everyone, but most everyone. But somewhere in there, is there some takeaway that I can internalize and say, gee, that's an interesting, different way of thinking about this. And I think that's the mentality and the approach that we as leaders have to take to every conversation, business and personal.
So not get lost in the nose diving puddles, or the nose diving drama that often happens. It often polarizes. It distracts. It's a distractive thing. And part of that, what helps me is, and when I started to learn this, it was really freeing for me. I used to think is whenever somebody said something, I had to say something in response. I had to say something about it in some way, or I had to agree or disagree. And when I started, and I learned this from somebody who did this with me, and I was the nose diver, right? So I was like, and this person simply responded, thank you for sharing. Okay. Do you want to know my perspective about the topic, not about what you said? They didn't say that, but just talked about the topic. And it's like, yeah. And what it did for me is it created a sense of space. It's like, oh, both perspectives can coexist. Now, as a leader, we have the extra task to create a perspective that is at the right altitude, meaning the most, to me is that that's the altitude that's most of service to what we're talking about. So that's another way, besides the technique of I don't have to say something about whatever people are saying to me. I can just say thank you. Otherwise, I'm nose diving with you, like going into the puddle with you. So thank you. And then what I can ask myself is, what's really of service here? And sometimes my inner voice is silent or just not sure yet. And then I go like, okay. Sometimes right altitude is, let me think about this for a moment. What does this mean? What would be really important for us to talk about now? Just ask the question to the group. You don't have to always have to do this all by yourself. Carson, final thought from you about altitude.
Altitude shifts happen for a reason, and it's not up to us to try to prevent them per se, because they are inevitable. But it is up to us as leaders to set the table, set the tone, create intentionally the altitude that we determine things should be at. As things are, moved here and there, I've spent a lot of time lately looking at, I think a lot of things operate on almost a pendulum swing. Whether it's cultural shifts or, adoption of technology, sometimes we rapidly go from one side to the other and it creates situations of extreme. The better that we can kind of keep balance, keep a steady hand on the wheel amidst these things, and really just observe and acknowledge and lean in with people where they are, the better we can determine what altitude we want to attempt to course correct to.
A steady hand of service with deep care for the people around us. Thank you for listening to Connected Teamwork Podcast. This time we talked about connected communication practice number 5, choosing your altitude deliberately. Next time we'll continue with number 6. You've been listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast, where we help leaders, teams, organizations connect more deeply to themselves, each other, and their purpose. See you next time here at the Connected Teamwork Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today that can help build your team. Also, if you like, think about one of your team members and what you appreciate about them. Let them know. Enjoy connecting more deeply to what is great about them. And see you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast.